great to be in Berlin again. This, I think, is my 15th visit to this great city over many years. And every time I come, I see new things, new change. It's a very innovative place. I think this is a great venue for this kind of innovation conference, this festival, to be in a place where the old is mixing with the new. So I'm going to speak to you today for a little while, as Stephanie indicated, about innovation and generational change, or what I call new leadership for the smart age. If future-minded urban planners have their way, within about 15 years of today, we may be living in smart cities, working in Industry 4 or smart industry. We may be using streets through augmented reality, driving in cars that are fueled by big data, on roads that are managed using the Internet of Things. We may be living and working in buildings that are basically self-contained hydroponic farms, with walls that breathe to keep us cool and warm, with glass that changes reflectivity according to the light available. We may have inbuilt recycling plants to keep us in a fresh supply of water, which will be the liquid gold of the 21st century. And we may have our own gardens in our workspaces to provide us with food. This is the dream of the urban planner. How close are we to the age of the smart town, the smart building, the smart office, and smart industry? Well, among us futurists, that's a subject for a lot of debate. But I think two things I can say with some certainty. Number one is this, that some of the revolutions that will underpin the smart age are with us already in terms of technology, ethics, values, and so on. The second thing that I can say is that technology is not destiny. We're not a product of the tools we use. We're a product of how human beings choose to use them. And human choice is usually shaped by a number of factors. And I want to share about one of those today, which is least often discussed in an event like this, and that is generational change. Every generation has its own biography, from childhood to adolescence, to adulthood, to eldership. And by sharing certain experiences over an era in history, every generation tends to develop shared characteristics. And please understand today, when I speak about generations, I am speaking generically and generally, so don't take offense at anything that I might say about your particular generation. Every generation has shared experience and therefore begins to look at innovating into different kinds of problems. And when we talk about the future of innovation for the next 20 years, we have to talk about two generations in particular. One of them is very well represented in this room today, I can see. Some people call it Generation Y. I don't like that name. I call them the Millennial generation because this generation came of age at the turning of the millennium. It's a generation that is aged in Germany today from around about 21 years to around about 36 years of age. Don't worry too much about the numbers. They're very general. The second generation after that, Stephanie referred to, some people call it Generation Z, and then we run out of letters and we have to start again. I call it Generation Edge, because this generation, aged 5 to 19 in Europe today, will face some of the biggest choices and changes of any generation in modern times when it comes to the human future. Now, every generation brings to the table a different kind of innovation leadership. And can I just say right up front, this term leadership is absolutely important to what I'm going to say today. Because when you talk about innovation, you're not talking about managing problems. You're talking about leading through a problem. Management largely, generically, very important to any organization, is about metrics, numbers, spreadsheets, targets. But leadership, as I'm defining it, is about mindsets, human thinking. Management is about structural engineering, but leadership is about cultural architecture. And I'm going to suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that every form of innovation that works is a form of leadership, because it introduces and helps create a culture in which problem solving is normal, which problem solving is the norm rather than the exception, and where people are the focus. And through this short session today, I want to talk to you about some of the influences that have shaped the millennials and Generation Edge, look at some of the characteristics that have emerged in those generations as a result. Thirdly, look at what that means to their impact on future innovation, and in all of that, hopefully, to put you slightly ahead of the change curve, so that you're able to innovate in those areas before they actually occur. Now, there are two revolutions that will underpin the smart age which have coincided with the introduction of the millennial generation. One of them is the globalization or globalism revolution. Many of you know that we add 3 million people to the cities of the world every week now. 54% of the world now lives in cities. By 2050, it may be as high as 70%. We know that within about 15 years of now in China, something like 260 million people will move into cities that don't even exist yet, but are being planned today. We also know that by 2030, 60% of India will be living in cities, which is going to bump up their fuel needs by a factor of about 5 times on what it is today. The second great revolution that has underpinned, or will underpin the smart age and coincides with millennials, is the digital revolution. We're about halfway through it right now. In 1985, when millennials first made their appearance, or were very young, the globe's technological capacity to store information was at the level of 2.5 billion gigabytes of information. By 2007, that 2.5 billion had ballooned out to 295 billion gigabytes globally. Today, every single day, you and I add 2.5 times 10 to the power 18, that's 2.5 quintillion bytes or keystrokes of information, to the global database we call the internet. That is a staggering number of zeros and a staggering amount of information. And globalization together with digitization has helped to produce certain things in the millennial generation, aged again between about 21 and 36 in Europe today. For one thing, millennials, and this comes out of much research by us and by other groups around the world, are generically speaking much more optimistic than Generation X that went before them. In a survey a few years ago, when millennials were teenagers, here in Europe, they were asked the question, which 2 groups of people do you think will have the biggest impact on the future? The top 2 responses were scientists and young people, in that order. This cohort, this generation, believes very strongly that if it is allowed the right resources and given the right opportunities, it will tell a completely different type of generational story. It wants to marry together the grassroots pragmatism of Generation X and the blue skies thinking of boomers, that's my generation, to create a totally new kind, a much more idealistic and optimistic kind of generational story. It is also a talented generation, particularly in terms of digital. If you're a millennial, I don't have to tell you that. It's a resourceful generation. By 2020, globally, millennials will have more spending power, this may surprise some of you, than even the boomers, who are supposed to be the ones with all the money. It's a very large generation, larger even than baby boomers. By 2025, something like 3 out of 5 workers globally will be millennials. And it is, it seems, a very innovative generation by nature, if not by choice. In a survey of the EU just 3 years ago, 46% of millennial young adults said, we want to start our own business in the next 5 years. Now, 46% historically is very high, not for America, but for Europe. This is, it seems, an innovative generation. It's also, because of globalism and digitization, a very collaborative generation. In many parts of the world, including, I suggest, here in Germany, this is the generation that best understands open innovation. Millennials have absolutely no problem understanding that walls between companies need to become more permeable, more open, because global problems will require convergent solutions. So right now we have medicine working with IT, working with additive manufacturing to give us 3D bioprinting. The possibility that within 8 years we will be able to totally build from a piece of cellular material an entire human organ like a kidney or a liver for transplant purposes, 3D bioprinting. Within 15 years, perhaps a human heart for transplant purposes, because of open innovation. In the next few years, open innovation will be greatly helped along by the Internet of Things. Most of you have heard that, and it sounds like a catchphrase because not much has happened yet. But it's beginning to catch on now. We're starting to see billions of processes built into everything from garden sprinkler systems to the heating system in your office to food packaging in refrigerators in some parts of the world now. All sending and receiving messages that purportedly make your life easier. Of course, the Internet of Things will be joined by big data. And I believe Millennials are the ones who'll get the best out of big data in the next 10 years. Big data is just a fancy way of saying we have networks of computers now that can crunch all the numbers coming in from mobile devices of all kinds and use it to predict such things as marketing trends, economic shifts, political voter patterns. It's not all theoretical. It's also used today in designing furniture, in designing houses and buildings, in designing cities. In some parts of the world, it's used to design better crime prevention programs. And much of this is driven by the millennial generation. It's a generation in front of the sharing economy, and in the next 5 to 10 years, it will become even bigger part of the millennial story. It's not really a sharing economy, actually. It's not sharing at all. It's a new way of buying and selling, but it sounds cool to call it a sharing economy. It's really shared ownership. And here in Berlin, as in London, where I come from, as in Sydney, as in New York and Los Angeles, you can share own many things. You can share own a car. You can share own a bicycle. In London, they call Boris bikes after Boris Johnson. You can share own an electric bicycle. You can share own a motor scooter. You can share own an apartment or a room within an apartment. Sharing economy. And it's even caught on in education today. Are there any educators in the house today? Any teachers, lecturers, academics? Thank you for coming today. Thank you. Education's become shared in that people are starting to put their complicated medical data online and ask others to interact, to help them find ways of managing their conditions. So this man, Salvatore Iaconesi, an Italian robotics engineer, was diagnosed with cancer just a few years ago, and rather than just passively waiting to see what happened, he took all of his medical data, put it online, and asked people to write with suggestions about the management of the condition or perhaps even suggestions for a cure. As you would imagine, some of them were a little bit, shall we say, out there, but he also had some very good suggestions. And I think more importantly, his site became a talking ground for advocates of folk medicine or traditional medicine and modern medicine, two groups of people that hardly ever talk to one another. If you're a millennial, you are the app generation. Technology is your rock and roll. For my generation, when a new album was released, people would line up down the street to buy it, and if it had a social consciousness message, a la Bob Dylan, the Nobel laureate, who may or may not turn up to receive his award, if there was a social consciousness message, people would gather around it and decide what to do about it, because music was the engine of social change for the boomer generation. For millennials, that is not true. We don't line up for music anymore, partly because we don't need to, but partly because technology has taken over for music as the hub around which social change occurs or forms. That's the size of technology when it comes to the millennials and the future of millennial thinking. As a result of that, and those characteristics, the characteristic of collaboration, I think we're going to see the millennials innovate in areas coming out of migration. Some of the challenges that come out of migration. Now, normally when I talk to people like this, they all look at me like, what are you talking about? But being in Germany today and in Berlin, you know about the challenges of the management of migration. It's not just mega cities that will drive the future, it's mega regions too. How many have heard this term, mega region? Couple, two or three. Mega regions are international pipelines connecting mega cities. Pipelines of trade, ideas, innovation, they just occur organically. Today, worldwide, there was something like 40 of these mega regions, including one in Africa. They represent just 18% of the world's population, but they're responsible for something like 85% of the scientific and technological innovation that's occurring on the planet today, which helps to explain why only 8% of the world's population own 82% of the wealth. They congregate in these areas. And that's why we have so many people, or part of the reason we have so many people migrating for economic opportunities, if not because of asylum seeking. And in the developed world, of course, we need migration, because without it we can't maintain the size of the population, our GDP and everything that comes from it. We just can't do it. Italy is dying today. The president of Italy admitted as much recently. Every generation of Spaniards is 40% smaller than the one that went before, because its fertility rate is just 1.27, but the replacement rate for any population is 2.1 children per woman. So migration is important in the millennial age. And there are issues that come on the back of that. And I think it's millennials that will make the big changes to things like social cohesion.